Barney was a part of everyone's childhood. The cheerful purple dinosaur, the upbeat songs, and the life lessons delivered in ways so simple they bordered on silly, it was all part of growing up for so many kids, including me. Sure, the show had its critics, but for me, Barney and Friends was a world I wanted to live in. When I was a kid, I practically lived for that show. I learned how to work the VHS recorder way earlier than most kids my age, and every morning before school, I'd tape every single episode. As soon as I got home, I'd hit play, watching the same episodes over and over. Some kids were obsessed with Sesame Street or Teletubbies or Thomas the Tank Engine. My world revolved around Barney. Now, I'm an adult, far too old to watch a show like that for myself. But there's an excuse, a very good excuse, that lets me revisit those days: my son, Chris. He's only 3, and I can't tell if it's because he senses how much the show means to me or because of its irresistible charm, but he adores Barney just as much as I once did. Every day, Chris would sit wide-eyed in front of the TV, captivated as Barney and his friends, Baby Bop, BJ, and Riff, taught valuable lessons with their cheerful songs and little dance routines. His favorite moment was always the same, when Barney would sing "I Love You." It didn't matter how much energy he had during the show's dance numbers or how excited he was when the gang solved their latest problem. When that song came on, Chris would drop to his knees in front of the screen, humming and singing along. Watching him in those moments, I felt a wave of nostalgia so strong it almost hurt. But like all good things, it couldn't last forever. Chris and I burned through all 14 seasons of Barney and Friends. Every episode. Twice. Maybe 3 times. It didn't help that season 14 wasn't even a real season, just reruns cobbled together from earlier episodes. One day, Chris looked up at me with those bright, hopeful eyes and asked for the next season. I froze, heart sinking. How could I explain that there wasn't any more Barney? That his purple dinosaur adventure was over? Chris didn't understand. When I told him there were no more episodes of Barney and Friends, that he had seen them all, his little world came crashing down. His crying wasn't the kind of crying you hear when a child falls or doesn't get their way. No, this was deeper. Heartbreaking. It was the raw, unfiltered sorrow of realizing something precious was gone forever. And watching him like that, it tore me apart. I couldn't let it end there. Without even thinking, I found myself promising him, "I'll find more, Chris. I'll find something." He trusted me, wiping his tears and settling down, though the look on his face was still one of quiet hope. He knew it would take time. I always told him that finding new shows meant waiting, but he believed in me. Now I had to deliver. I spent hours scouring the internet, diving into forums and websites, searching for anything that might breathe new life into Chris's favorite show. It was during one of these late-night searches that I stumbled upon something I had never heard of before: the Actimates Barney doll. According to an old trivia entry on a Barney and Friends fan wiki, between 1997 and 2000, episodes of the show were encoded with special signals that allowed this doll to interact with what was happening on the screen. I couldn't believe such technology existed back then. Apparently, with the right setup, a TV pack linked to the doll, Barney would act as a co-viewer, talking, singing, and interacting with kids during specific moments of the show. I sat there in awe, piecing it together. If I could track down one of these dolls, along with the compatible equipment, Chris wouldn't just be watching Barney, he'd be with Barney. He'd have an entirely new way to experience the show, something even I never had as a child. I couldn't stop myself from imagining it: Chris sitting on the floor, Barney right beside him, singing, counting, and playing together. It was perfect. It was magical. And it felt like redemption. When I was Chris's age, I begged my parents for a Barney plushie, just a simple toy to hold on to. But they always said the same thing: we can't afford it. Now, as an adult, I could finally give my son the Barney experience I never had. With a new sense of purpose, I began my search for an Actimates Barney doll, a TV pack, and the encoded episodes. It wasn't going to be easy. This technology was decades old, practically forgotten, but I had to try. I read more about the doll, how it was considered groundbreaking at the time. Kids could interact with Barney as he watched episodes alongside them, reinforcing educational lessons through playful songs and games. It was an entire generation's dream come true, though I somehow missed it during my childhood. The more I learned, the more determined I became. I was going to find it. But as I dug deeper, something about this whole thing began to feel off. The forums where people discussed the Actimates Barney were ancient, the posts riddled with broken links and dead-end threads. There were strange mentions too, hushed comments about malfunctions and unusual behavior. Still, I pushed on, brushing aside the unease. It was all worth it to see Chris smile again. Or so I thought. It took 2 or 3 weeks before I got a response. One of the forum posts I had made, a plea for anyone willing to sell their Actimates Barney set, finally got a bite. The price? Surprisingly high for a toy nearly 2 decades old, but I wasn't surprised. Clearly, others had the same idea as me. Still, I was relentless. The thought of Chris's face lighting up when he saw Barney come to life was all I needed to keep pushing. I haggled harder than I ever had before, and finally, I got the set at a price I could afford. The man selling it seemed unusually eager to part with it. He could have asked for far more and likely still found a buyer, but he didn't. Oddly enough, he even sounded relieved, like he wanted it gone as quickly as possible. When the day came to pick it up, I drove to his house. He lived nearby, so it was a short trip. I met him outside, and he led me to his spotless white van parked in the driveway. It looked almost new, gleaming under the sun. The transaction was quick. I handed over the money, and he brought out a box containing everything I needed, the doll, the TV pack, and the compatible tapes. He even carried it to my car. I thought it was kind of him at the time, though I did catch a glimpse of something in his expression as he handed it off, a flicker of relief. But I didn't dwell on it. My mind was too consumed with one thought, getting home and showing Chris. When I walked through the door, I shouted for him, maybe a bit too loudly. Chris came running, looking hesitant, like he thought he might be in trouble. I knelt down, my heart pounding with excitement, and explained everything I had been doing, how I had been searching for something special just for him. Then, from behind the door frame, I revealed the box. The look on his face in that moment, it was everything. Pure, unfiltered joy. His eyes lit up, his smile stretched so wide it almost hurt to look at. For a brief second, it felt like the world had no sadness in it at all. Chris tried to drag the box to the living room himself, but it was too big for him. I followed, taking over to carry it the rest of the way. He was buzzing with excitement, nearly bouncing off the walls as I began setting it up. It wasn't easy. The set was old, and without an instruction manual, it took longer than I expected to get everything working. But through all of it, Chris's enthusiasm didn't falter. He sat there, watching my every move, his little hands fidgeting in anticipation. Finally, I got it running. The tape began to play, and Barney appeared on the screen, welcoming the viewers with his familiar, cheerful voice. As I stepped away, Chris stopped me. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice small but concerned. "Aren't you going to watch it with me?" The intro music was starting, but I knelt in front of him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "This is an experience I want you to have, just you and Barney," I said, pointing to the plush doll sitting beside him. He nodded, grinning so wide it seemed like his face might burst. Then, as Barney began to sing, Chris turned back to the TV, completely lost in the magic. I stepped back, leaning against the doorframe, watching him for a moment longer. The way he sat there, transfixed, Barney's cheerful song filling the room, it was perfect. Or so I thought. I headed to the kitchen to make some coffee and spent the rest of the afternoon upstairs in my room, letting Chris enjoy his new setup. I could hear the show playing faintly from the living room, Barney's cheerful voice singing and laughing with the kids on screen. It wasn't until the sound of the TV died down that I assumed Chris had finished watching. Curious to see what he wanted to do next, I went downstairs. But before I could open the living room door, I heard something. Chris was talking. His voice sounded off. distressed, almost like he was upset with someone. For a moment, I thought maybe his mother had come home early and scolded him for something. I opened the door, ready to step in, but what I saw made me freeze. Chris's head snapped toward me so quickly it was unnatural, almost like he'd been caught doing something he shouldn't. He was holding the Barney doll tightly in front of him, his small hands gripping it like a lifeline. "Chris," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What's going on?" There was a moment of silence. His wide eyes darted between me and the doll, as if deciding what to say. Then, as quick as a whistle, he blurted out, "Nothing." His voice was light, almost too casual, brushing it off like it was no big deal. Before I could ask anything else, he bolted past me, clutching Barney, and headed straight for the kitchen. I just stood there, staring at the empty living room, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The room was quiet, nothing out of place. No broken toys, no mess, no sign of anything unusual. Then I heard Chris calling from the kitchen. "Can you help me pour a drink?" Reluctantly, I left the living room and went to him. He was already sitting at the table, Barney propped up beside him like a silent companion. I helped him with his drink, but the unease I felt didn't go away. After that, I started checking on Chris more often while he was watching his show. But every time I opened the door, it was the same routine. The moment he heard me coming, he would stop whatever he was doing, sit up straight, and stare at the TV as if nothing had happened. It was as if he was waiting for me to leave so he could go back to whatever it was he was doing. I tried asking him about it a few times, but he'd always brush me off with a quick, "Nothing, Dad," before changing the subject. Still, I noticed things. Chris began carrying that Barney doll everywhere he went. He'd talk to it constantly, telling it about his day, his thoughts, and whatever else came to his mind. If we went out, the first thing he'd do when we got home was sit down with Barney and start talking again, as if catching him up on everything he'd missed. At first, it was kind of sweet. I figured he was just indulging in a bit of innocent imagination. Kids his age often have imaginary friends, and my parents told me I'd been the same way when I was little. Maybe he thought I'd find it weird and tell him to stop, so he kept it to himself. That thought gave me peace of mind. But then preschool let out for the term, and Chris started watching the show religiously, morning, afternoon, and evening. It didn't even matter if the episode wasn't compatible with the Actimate's technology. He'd still sit there with Barney, talking to him, laughing, and occasionally singing along. It was during one of those long afternoons that I noticed something strange. Barney's voice wasn't just coming from the TV anymore. The Barney doll had built-in phrases, clever little lines like, "I like watching TV with you." It made sense why Chris continued using the doll, even when it wasn't synced with the show. It wasn't unusual for him to hold on to Barney during quiet moments, softly chatting to him as if the doll were listening. One afternoon, as I stood at the top of the stairs listening, I felt a mix of emotions. There was something so pure about the way Chris spoke to Barney, like the doll was his best friend. His innocence was touching, and I didn't want to intrude on his little world. But then I heard it. A voice. Deep. Unfamiliar. I froze, gripping the banister, straining to listen. It wasn't Chris. The voice was too low, too adult, and it sent a shiver down my spine. My heart pounded as I tried to convince myself it must have been a glitch from the doll's built-in phrases. But it didn't fit. The tone was wrong. Before I could stop myself, I rushed downstairs and burst into the living room. Chris looked up at me, startled, clutching his Barney doll tightly to his chest. His wide eyes darted between me and the television, as though I'd caught him in the middle of something he didn't want me to see. "What's going on?" I demanded, though I instantly regretted my tone. Chris just stared at me, his face a mixture of fear and confusion. Slowly, he shook his head and mumbled, "Nothing." That evening at dinner, Chris sat quietly, picking at his food. I finally broke the silence. "What's wrong, buddy?" I asked gently. Without looking up, he muttered, "Barney doesn't like you anymore." It was like a punch to the gut. I didn't know how to respond. I forced a smile and tried to brush it off, but inside, I felt crushed. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had invaded something I wasn't supposed to. From that night on, Chris seemed distant. He still needed me for little things, fetching his Barney tapes from the top shelf, pouring his drinks, but he talked to me less and less. He never mentioned what Barney had said, and no matter how much I tried, I couldn't get him to open up. I told myself it was just a phase, that it was normal for kids to form deep attachments to their toys or imaginary friends. After all, I had my own invisible companions as a child. But it was hard to ignore how Chris's behavior changed. He spent hours in front of the TV, even watching episodes that weren't compatible with the Actimate's technology. And every time I tried to check on him, he'd stop talking the moment he heard me coming, sitting up straight and pretending to focus on the screen. As the end of his school break approached, Chris had worked his way through all the Barney tapes I'd managed to find, along with some of his favorite episodes on repeat. On his last day off, his mother and I sat him down to explain that he'd need to go back to his regular bedtime routine since school was starting again. He didn't argue much, but the look on his face as he trudged off to bed stayed with me. The first day back at school, Chris woke up groggy, which wasn't surprising. No kid transitions easily from a holiday sleep schedule. But as the days turned into weeks, I noticed a pattern. Every morning, Chris was more and more tired. At first, I chalked it up to adjustment, but by the second week, I started to worry. His eyes were constantly ringed with dark circles, and his energy seemed drained. By the third week, my concern grew into suspicion. Something wasn't right. So, one night, I decided to test the theory. "Chris," I said, tucking him into bed. "Go to sleep at your usual time tonight, okay?" He nodded sleepily, clutching Barney close to him. I kissed his forehead and left the room, leaving the door cracked open just enough to peek through. Then I waited. I waited down the hall, perched on a creaky wooden chair, my nerves on edge. The minutes stretched into hours, the house silent save for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I stayed vigilant, determined to catch Chris in the act. An hour passed. Then two. By the third, the quiet was finally broken. The soft creak of his bedroom door made my breath hitch. I stayed still, barely daring to move as Chris shuffled out, rubbing his eyes like he had just woken from a deep sleep. In his arms, he cradled the Barney doll, holding it tight as though it were whispering secrets meant only for him. He didn't head for the living room as I had expected. Instead, he turned left. Toward the front door. My stomach churned as I watched him reach up, standing on tiptoe to unlatch the lock. His tiny fingers moved deliberately, like he knew exactly what he was doing. I couldn't stay quiet any longer. "Chris! Stop!" I bellowed, my voice echoing through the darkened hall. He froze, his hand still gripping the latch. As I stomped down the stairs, the panic in his eyes was unmistakable. He clutched Barney tighter, trembling slightly as I grabbed his arm. For a long moment, I stared at him, my gaze hard, trying to understand what I had just witnessed. Finally, I asked, my voice low but firm, "Son, why did you unlatch the door?" His lip quivered. Tears welled in his wide eyes, and his voice came out barely above a whisper. "But Barney told me to do it." A chill ran down my spine. The absurdity of his answer, mixed with my growing frustration, pushed me over the edge. Without thinking, I swung my hand, landing a sharp smack on his bottom. He cried, loud and broken, and I hated myself for it. But I couldn't let him get away with what I thought was just a lie. Carrying him back to his room, I tucked him in with short, clipped movements. "We'll talk about this in the morning," I muttered, leaving him sniffling under his blanket. I recounted the incident to my wife later that night, but even as I explained it, the words felt hollow. There was a nagging unease I couldn't shake, a question I didn't want to ask myself: what if he wasn't lying? Sleep came fitfully, plagued by dreams of whispered voices and shadows at the edges of my mind. The next morning, Chris sat at the breakfast table, his small frame hunched over, his face a mix of emotions I couldn't untangle. Guilt gnawed at me as I watched him pick at his cereal, refusing to meet my eyes. I sat across from him, trying to keep my tone gentle. "Chris," I began, "why did you try to open the front door last night?" For a moment, he didn't respond. Then, slowly, he raised his head, his voice trembling as he repeated, "Barney told me to do it." I felt my patience fray. "Chris," I said, my voice rising despite myself, "Barney is just a toy. He can't talk to you, and he certainly can't tell you to do things." His eyes widened, filling with tears, but there was something else in his gaze this time, something close to fear. "But he did," Chris insisted, his voice cracking. "He talks to me when you're not there. He tells me things." I leaned back, my heart thudding in my chest. What kinds of things?" Chris hesitated, clutching Barney tighter. He says he likes me better when I listen to him. And last night, he said I had to open the door, because he wanted to go outside." The room felt colder. I stared at the doll in Chris's arms, its frozen, cheerful smile suddenly menacing under the morning light. "Chris," I said slowly, my throat dry, "has Barney ever told you to do anything else?" He nodded. "What else did he tell you to do?" Chris hesitated again, his small hands trembling as he held the doll. Finally, he whispered, "He says not to tell you, because you wouldn't like it." The sight of Chris's door hanging wide open stopped me cold. A chill coursed through me as my mind raced. He was supposed to be in bed. I stepped closer, the floorboards creaking under my weight, and peered inside. His room was dimly lit by the glow of his Barney nightlight. The bed was empty, the blankets rumpled, as though he had left in a hurry. The doll was gone too. "Chris?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. I scanned the room for any clue of where he might have gone. His favorite book was still on the nightstand, untouched. The stack of Barney VHS tapes was neatly arranged on the shelf. It looked like everything was in its place, except for Chris. I turned back to the hallway, my heart pounding harder with each passing second. I didn't want to admit it, but the thought that Barney could have said something lingered in my mind like a dark shadow. I shook the idea away, trying to focus. "Chris?" I called again, louder this time. A faint sound came from downstairs. It wasn't the TV, it was something softer, rhythmic. Almost like humming. I moved cautiously toward the staircase, the faint noise growing clearer with each step. It was a melody. A melody I recognized. "I love you, you love me." The familiar Barney theme drifted up the stairs, but it wasn't coming from the television. It sounded wrong. Distorted, almost mechanical, yet hauntingly close. My pulse quickened as I descended the stairs, each creak of the steps echoing louder than it should in the silent house. The humming grew louder as I reached the bottom, leading me toward the front door. The door was ajar, the cool night air creeping into the house. "Chris!" I shouted, panic seizing me as I rushed forward. There he was, standing on the porch, the Barney doll clutched tightly to his chest. His small frame was silhouetted against the streetlights outside, unmoving, like he was frozen in place. "Chris," I said, softer now, trying not to startle him. "What are you doing out here?" He didn't turn to face me. Instead, he whispered, so faintly I had to strain to hear. He said I have to go with him. I felt my breath catch in my throat. "Go where?" I asked, stepping closer. Chris finally turned to look at me, his face pale, his eyes wide with tears brimming at the edges. He said there's a place we can play, forever. But I told him you said I can't. "Chris, listen to me," I said firmly, kneeling to his level. "Barney isn't real. He can't tell you what to do. You have to stay here, with me. Do you understand?" His lip trembled, but he nodded slowly. I gently took his hand and led him back inside, locking the door behind us. As I tucked him back into bed, he clung to the Barney doll, refusing to let it go. "Chris," I said softly, "maybe it's time we put Barney away for a little while." His grip tightened on the doll, his eyes welling up again. "But he'll be mad at me." "Nothing can hurt you, Chris." "Not while I'm here," I assured him, stroking his hair until he finally closed his eyes and drifted off to sleep. But as I left his room, closing the door behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. From the shadows. From the doll. I held the Barney doll in my trembling hands, staring at the now darkened two-way radio inside. My mind raced. Someone had been watching us. Listening. Talking to my son through this toy. My eyes darted to the open front door, and my chest tightened as I replayed the sound of that van screeching away. How close had I come to losing him? "Chris!" I shouted again, my voice cracking as I ran through the house. My footsteps echoed in the empty rooms. The kitchen was empty. The dining room was empty. The panic rose in my throat like bile as I checked every corner. He wasn't anywhere. Then I remembered the basement. I dashed to the basement door, flinging it open so hard it slammed against the wall. The stairs stretched down into the darkness. "Chris?" I called, my voice trembling. A faint whimper rose from below. Relief and fear mixed as I grabbed a flashlight from the wall and descended the creaking steps. The beam of light bounced ahead of me, illuminating shelves of old boxes and forgotten trinkets. "Chris, it's Dad. Where are you?" In here came a small, shaky voice. I swung the flashlight toward the sound and saw him huddled in the corner behind an old chest, clutching his knees to his chest. His Barney doll was nowhere in sight. I rushed to him, dropping to my knees and pulling him into a tight hug. He was shaking like a leaf. "Chris, are you okay? What happened?" He didn't answer at first, burying his face in my chest. Then, in a muffled voice, he whispered, "Barney said I couldn't tell you, or he'd get mad." I held him tighter, my own fear threatening to consume me. "Chris, listen to me. Barney is just a toy. He can't hurt you, and no one is going to take you away. I won't let that happen. Do you understand?" Chris nodded hesitantly, but his grip on me didn't loosen. I decided then and there that the doll had to go. I wasn't going to let it torment my son, or give anyone else a way to do so. The next morning, I packed the doll into a box and drove to the nearest dump. Chris watched me silently from the window as I loaded it into the car. His eyes were red-rimmed, and I knew he hadn't slept. At the dump, I tossed the box into the incinerator, watching as the flames consumed it. The plastic melted, the fabric blackened, and the two-way radio sparked one last time before disappearing into ash. For the first time in days, I felt a sliver of peace. But that night, as I lay in bed, I woke to the sound of faint humming. "I love you, you love me." The song drifted through the house, growing louder, and with it came a voice that sent chills down my spine. "You shouldn't have done that.